Weather anchors called it a generational anomaly. When mercury plummeted toward -40 degrees, local power lines didn't just fail, systems shattered. While freezing neighbors burned wooden furniture, avoiding hypothermia, Clara Higgins sat comfortably inside a 55-degree cabin, sustained entirely by warm dirt packed deep beneath her winter boots. It was August when the digging started. In the remote, heavily forested community of Pine Ridge, Montana, summer was brief and fiercely cherished. Residents spent the warm months fishing, hiking, and stockpiling standard winter supplies, chopped cordwood, diesel fuel, and canned goods. But Clara Higgins was busy tearing her own property to shreds. Clara, a former structural engineer who had relocated to Pine Ridge 2 years prior, had hired an excavator to gouge a massive 10-foot-deep crater directly beneath the foundation of her unfinished greenhouse and cabin extension. Day after day, the roar of heavy machinery echoed through the valley, drowning out the peaceful sounds of the mountain summer. Her closest neighbor, Thomas Bennett, watched from his porch with a mixture of amusement and irritation. Tom was a pragmatic man, a lifelong resident of Pine Ridge who believed survival was a simple equation of a loud diesel generator and a reliable wood-burning stove. "You striking oil over there, Clara?" Tom yelled one afternoon, leaning over the barbed wire fence that separated their properties. Clara wiped the sweat from her forehead, her boots caked in thick, dark Montana clay. "Building a battery, Tom," she called back, her voice carrying a tense exhaustion. "A battery made of dirt?" Tom scoffed, taking a sip of his iced tea. "You know, if you just wanted to keep the lights on, the hardware store in town sells a 10,000-watt dual-fuel rig for $1,000, saves you having to dig to China." Clara didn't bother explaining the intricacies of an annualized geo-solar system to him. People in Pine Ridge didn't understand her obsession with self-reliance, because they didn't know the ghost that chased her. 4 years earlier, Clara had lived in Texas during the catastrophic winter grid failure. She had watched helplessly as the temperature in her suburban home dropped to 20 degrees. Her mother, Margaret, who relied on an oxygen concentrator and was fragile from a recent bout of pneumonia, didn't survive the third night of the freeze. Clara had watched the systems society trusted blindly fail overnight. She vowed she would never freeze again, and more importantly, she would never outsource her survival to a fragile grid. So, while Tom bought diesel, Clara built her fortress. The concept was brilliant but required grueling, obsessive labor. Beneath the footprint of her home, Clara laid down thick layers of rigid XPS foam insulation, creating an impermeable subterranean basin. Inside this insulated bowl, she laid down miles of coiled corrugated PEX tubing, weaving it through hundreds of tons of compacted soil and sand. Above ground, attached to the south-facing wall of her cabin, was a massive thermal solar collector, essentially a highly efficient glass box designed to trap the intense summer heat. Fans, powered by a modest solar array, pulled the blistering 130-degree air from the collector and drove it deep underground through the PEX tubing. All summer long, Clara was pumping the blazing summer heat into the earth. The soil absorbed the thermal energy, and because it was wrapped in heavy insulation, the heat couldn't escape. It was a massive thermal battery. By late September, the block of dirt beneath her living room had reached a staggering 82 degrees Fahrenheit. But as October rolled in and the first frosts kissed the pine trees, the town's skepticism turned into outright whispers of concern. Clara had completely ignored the standard preparations. She had no massive woodpile. She had no propane tank. She just had a strange, silent patch of earth and a house that looked like a science experiment. Mayor Sullivan, a friendly but overly nosy local authority, even paid her a visit. "Clara, we're expecting a tough winter," he warned, standing in her driveway while eyeing the glass collectors. "The Farmer's Almanac is predicting heavy snows. If you need help cutting wood, the boys at the firehouse can come up." "I appreciate it, Mayor." Clara had smiled politely, "but I've already stored my heat." The mayor left shaking his head. In a town where winter survival was an active, physical battle against the elements, Clara's passive reliance on warm dirt seemed not just foolish, but suicidal. Then came December, and the weather didn't just turn cold, it weaponized. Meteorologists call it a sudden stratospheric warming event, a disruption so violent it pushes the polar vortex off its axis, spilling Arctic air straight down into the mid-latitudes. But on the news, they simply called it the deep freeze. It began on a Tuesday. The morning temperature was a mild 20 degrees, but the sky had a strange, bruised, metallic tint to it. By noon, the wind began to howl, a shrieking gale that stripped the remaining dead leaves from the oaks and rattled the window panes. By 4 p.m., the temperature had plummeted to zero. By midnight, it was -20. In her cabin, Clara sat by the window, watching the digital thermometer plunge. She felt a knot of pure, unadulterated terror tightening in her chest. The trauma of the Texas freeze came rushing back, the smell of the cold, the agonizing sound of her mother's failing breath. Her hands shook as she checked her system monitor. The ambient temperature outside was dropping faster than the meteorologists had predicted. At 2:15 a.m., the catastrophe struck. A high-voltage transmission tower 50 miles away, its metal embrittled by the flash freeze and battered by 80-mile-per-hour winds, snapped in half. Clara saw it happen through her window. Not the tower falling, but the result. A brilliant, terrifying flash of blue-green light illuminated the distant mountain ridge, followed by the sickening deep boom of a substation transformer exploding. Instantly, the lights across the entire Pine Ridge Valley blinked out. The hum of refrigerators died. The glowing LEDs of microwaves vanished. The grid was dead. Next door, Tom Bennett woke up to the sudden silence. He cursed, throwing off his heavy blankets, his breath already visible in the air of his bedroom. "All right," he muttered, grabbing his heavy coat and a flashlight. "Time to earn your keep." He trudged out to his shed, the cold punching him in the lungs like a heavyweight fighter. It was -35 degrees. At this temperature, the physical world begins to break down. Pine trees in the surrounding forest were literally exploding, the sap freezing and expanding so rapidly that the trunks split open with sounds like rifle shots. Tom reached his expensive, top-of-the-line diesel generator. He primed it, choked it, and pulled the cord. Nothing. It was stiff, sluggish. He pulled again, harder this time. Sputter. Cough. Silence. Panic. A cold, oily sensation began to pool in Tom's stomach. He checked the fuel line. His heart dropped. In his hubris, he had bought standard summer blend diesel months ago and forgotten to add winter anti-gel additives. The fuel inside the tank hadn't just gotten cold, it had turned into a thick, useless jelly. The generator was $1,000 paperweight. Back inside his house, the temperature was free-falling. Without power, his furnace fan couldn't push the heat from his wood stove through the house. The water in his pipes began to freeze, letting out groans and sharp cracks. Worse, Tom wasn't alone. His 8-year-old daughter, Chloe, was visiting for the holidays. She was huddled under a mountain of blankets in the living room, shivering violently. "Daddy, it hurts," she whimpered, her teeth chattering so hard she could barely form the words. "I know, baby." "I know," Tom said, his voice trembling as he frantically tried to build a larger fire in the living room stove. But a single wood stove in a large, drafty house at -40 degrees is like holding a match up to a glacier. The cold was a living, breathing entity, pressing against the windows, seeping through the floorboards. Meanwhile, 100 yards away, Clara was holding her breath. When the power died, her cabin was plunged into darkness. But she didn't panic. She walked to her utility closet and flipped a heavy switch. A small, deep-cycle marine battery bank, charged by her solar panels, came to life. It wasn't designed to power the whole house. It was designed for one specific task. With a soft, almost imperceptible whir, two small, highly efficient inline duct fans turned on. Down in the earth, beneath the frost line, the thermal battery was waiting. It had been sealed for months, holding on to the searing heat of August. The fans began to pull the freezing air from Clara's cabin down into the labyrinth of PEX tubing buried in the 80-degree dirt. Clara stood over the floor, register in her living room, waiting. The seconds stretched into eternity. If her math was wrong, if the insulation had failed, if the earth had leached the heat away, she would freeze. Then, she felt it. A gentle, steady sigh of warm air drifted up from the vent. It wasn't blasting hot air like a gas furnace. It was a subtle, radiant warmth, a continuous flow of 6-5-degree air. While the world outside screamed and shattered in apocalyptic cold, Clara's cabin slowly stabilized at a comfortable 55 degrees. She didn't need a heavy coat. She didn't need to burn anything. The ghost of her mother's freezing room slowly faded from her mind. The earth was saving her. By 6 a.m., the situation next door had reached critical mass. Tom's living room thermometer read 28 degrees and was still dropping. Chloe had stopped shivering, her eyes half closed and glassy, a terrifying sign of advancing hypothermia. Tom looked out his frosted window. The valley was pitch black, a frozen graveyard. But through the biting wind and blowing snow, he saw a faint, warm, yellowish glow coming from Clara's property. She had a single battery-powered LED lamp on in her window. He didn't have time to be proud. He didn't have time to be a skeptic. He wrapped Chloe in a heavy wool blanket, picked her up, and kicked his front door open. The 100-yard walk to Clara's house was a nightmare. The wind cut through his heavy canvas coat, like it was made of tissue paper. Every breath felt like inhaling ground glass. His eyelashes froze together. By the time he reached Clara's porch, he couldn't feel his legs. He hammered on her door with a frozen, numb fist. Clara jolted awake from a light doze on her sofa. She approached the door cautiously and peered through the peephole. Seeing Tom's frostbitten face and the bundle in his arms, she unbolted the heavy door and threw it open. Tom stumbled inside, collapsing to his knees on Clara's entryway rug. The sudden, astonishing warmth of the cabin hit him like a physical blow. There was no fire roaring, no generator humming outside, yet the air was miraculously, impossibly warm. "Clara," Tom choked out, his voice cracking as he looked down at his unresponsive daughter. "Please. I was wrong. Help us." Clara didn't hesitate. She grabbed the frozen, trembling bundle from Tom's arms, hauling 8-year-old Chloe onto the living room rug. Tom collapsed against the heavy oak door, pushing it shut against the screaming wind, his chest heaving as he tried to drag oxygen into his burning, frost-scorched lungs. "Don't put her near a fire, Tom," Clara commanded, her voice steady, tapping into the emergency response training she had obsessively consumed after the Texas grid failure. "Rapid warming will send her into shock. We need to raise her core temperature slowly." Tom could only nod, his jaw locked in a violent shiver. He watched through blurred vision as Clara stripped away the girl's stiff, ice-caked outer layers. Beneath them, Chloe's skin was pale and waxy. Her lips tinted a terrifying shade of bruised violet. Clara wrapped the girl in a dry, heavy-down comforter and positioned her directly over the floor register. From the vent, a steady, invisible current of 65-degree air washed over them. It smelled faintly of dry clay and ozone. To Tom, who had just spent 10 minutes battling an apocalyptic -40-degree gale, that gentle breeze felt like the breath of God. "Drink this," Clara said, suddenly appearing in front of Tom with a steaming thermos cap. "It's lukewarm electrolyte water. Not hot. Just drink it." Tom took it with shaking, numb fingers. "How?" he rasped, looking around the dimly lit room. A single, battery-powered lantern sat on the kitchen counter. There was no fireplace roaring, no heavy scent of diesel exhaust. The cabin was completely silent, save for the faint, rhythmic whir of the 2 inline duct fans hidden behind the utility closet door. "Clara," How is it warm in here? The grid is dead. The dirt, Tom. Clara replied softly, sitting beside Chloe and rubbing the girl's arms through the blanket. I told you I was building a battery. All summer, those solar collectors on the side of the house trapped the sun's heat. Those fans pushed 130-degree air down into the earth beneath the foundation. Dirt is incredibly dense. It has massive thermal mass. I trapped the heat with heavy insulation, and now I'm just pulling it back up. Tom stared at the floor, realizing that just 10 feet beneath the frozen, apocalyptic hellscape outside, a massive block of earth was glowing with the trapped heat of August. It's brilliant, he whispered, a tear of sheer relief freezing on his cheek. You aren't burning anything. Nothing but a few amps from a deep cycle marine battery to run the fans, Clara said. For the next 12 hours, the cabin remained an island of sanity in an ocean of violence. Outside, the sudden stratospheric warming event worsened. The wind shear tore the roof off the Pine Ridge hardware store and snapped century-old pine trees in half. The temperature bottomed out at negative 46 degrees. Inside, Chloe regained her color. By mid-afternoon, she was sitting up, drinking warm broth. Clara had heated on a small butane camping stove and coloring by the light of the LED lantern. The cabin held steady at 54 degrees. It wasn't exactly beach weather, but they were in light sweaters, completely safe from the lethal elements. But the peace was a fragile illusion. At 4 p.m., a sharp, electronic beep shattered the quiet of the cabin. Clara's head snapped toward the utility closet. She stood up quickly, abandoning the book she was reading, and pulled open the louvered door. Inside, a small digital display attached to her 1-2-volt battery bank was flashing a red warning light. Quate revolts. Tom, sensing the shift in her demeanor, stepped up behind her. What is it? The fans, Clara said, her voice tight. They only draw about 40 watts combined, but they've been running continuously for 14 hours. Normally, my solar panels would top the battery off during the day, even in winter. Tom looked out the window. There was no day. The blizzard was a raging, blinding whiteout, and the snow was falling horizontally. The panels are buried, he realized, under at least 2 feet of snow and ice. Clara nodded slowly. The inverter has a low-voltage disconnect to protect the battery. If it drops to 10.5 volts, the system shuts down. The fans stop. And if the fans stop, the heat stays trapped underground, Clara said, looking Tom directly in the eye. My cabin is well insulated, but without the active draw from the earth, the ambient temperature in here will start to equalize with the outside. It will take a few hours, but we will freeze. The twist of fate was cruel. Clara had enough heat stored beneath them to last until April, but without the tiny trickle of electricity to move the air, they were going to freeze to death while sitting directly on top of a furnace. By 8 p.m., the situation grew desperate. Clara brought out a small hand-crank emergency weather radio to monitor the outside world, hoping for news of grid restoration. The voice of Sheriff Miller, broadcasted from the county seat on a backup generator, crackled through the static. Repeat. All county plows have been grounded. Visibility is 0. The emergency shelter at the high school has lost its primary heating oil pump. We are advising all residents to shelter in place, consolidate body heat, and await military transport once the storm breaks. Do not attempt to travel. The cold is instantly lethal. Tom looked at Chloe, who had fallen asleep on the sofa, clutching a throw pillow. He had promised himself he would protect her, and now they were trapped in a dying hourglass. Beep! 11 volts. How long do we have? Tom asked, his voice low. An hour, Clara replied, her hands resting on the counter. Maybe less. Tom paced the floor, his pragmatic mechanical mind racing. He was a man used to turning wrenches, to fixing things with grease and steel. We just need 1-2 volt power, he muttered. A car battery, Clara, my truck. I have a heavy-duty diesel rig parked in my driveway. It has dual 1-2 volt 850 cold cranking amp batteries. If we can get one out and bring it here, we can wire it to your inverter. Clara stared at him. Tom, it's negative 40 degrees out there with 50-mile-an-hour winds. The wind chill is -70. Your driveway is 100 yards away. You wouldn't even be able to see your hand in front of your face. You'll get lost and freeze to death 10 feet from the porch. I have to try, Tom said, his eyes hardening. If I don't, Chloe dies. At 9:15 p.m., the inverter clicked. The red light went solid. The low hum of the inline fans abruptly stopped. Silence descended on the cabin, heavy and ominous. Within 20 minutes, the temperature in the living room dropped from 54 degrees to 48. The heavy insulation of the cabin fought valiantly, but the cold pressing against the exterior walls was absolute. Tom had already geared up. He wore every layer of clothing Clara could spare, wrapped a wool scarf tightly around his face, and wore 2 pairs of heavy ski gloves. Around his waist, Clara tied a heavy nylon climbing rope. I have 200 feet of this, Clara said, securing the other end to the heavy iron post of her stairwell. You keep this taut. Do not untie it, no matter what happens. When you get the battery, yank the rope 3 times. I'll start pulling you back. Tom nodded, pulling down his insulated goggles. He grabbed a heavy crescent wrench and a flashlight, shoving them into his deep pockets. He looked at Clara, a deep respect in his eyes. You kept my little girl alive today, Clara. Now it's my turn to keep your dirt breathing. He opened the door. The roar of the storm was deafening, a physical wall of freezing pressure that knocked him backward. He lowered his shoulder, leaned into the gale, and stepped off the porch into the black void. Clara slammed the door shut and braced herself against the frame, feeding the rope out inch by agonizing inch. Outside, Tom was instantly submerged in a sensory deprivation tank of ice. The flashlight beam penetrated no more than 2 feet into the swirling whiteout. Every step was a battle through thigh-high drifts. The cold bypassed his heavy coat entirely, biting into his ribs, stealing the heat from his blood. He counted his paces. 10, 20, 30. He knew his property layout by heart, but in the blinding dark, spatial awareness vanished. He felt the rope tugging at his waist, his only tether to reality. 50, 60. His foot struck something solid. Metal. He reached out with heavily gloved hands and brushed away the snow. The familiar grille of his Ford F-250. He fumbled in his pocket for his keys, but his fingers were already losing dexterity. He had to take off his thick outer glove, exposing his thin liner glove to the negative 40-degree air. The pain was instantaneous, like a hammer smashing his fingertips. He found the hood release and yanked it. The hood was frozen shut. Tom cursed, leaning his entire body weight onto the icy metal, bouncing, trying to crack the ice seal. He had been outside for maybe 4 minutes, but his mind was already growing sluggish, the terrifying, seductive lethargy of hypothermia creeping into his brain. Just sit down in the snow for a second, a voice whispered. No, Tom growled, thinking of Chloe's purple lips. He grabbed his heavy crescent wrench and began smashing it into the ice build-up along the hood seams. Crack, crack. With a brutal heave, the hood popped open. He jammed the flashlight into his mouth to illuminate the engine bay. The heavy-duty battery sat on the left side. Working with near-frozen hands, he applied the wrench to the negative terminal. His fine motor skills were gone. He was operating purely on adrenaline and gross muscle memory. He managed to loosen the bolts, yanking the heavy cables free. He grabbed the battery by its plastic handle and hoisted it out. It weighed 50 pounds. But right now, it was the most precious object on Earth. He dropped the wrench, grabbed the rope at his waist, and gave it 3 violent, desperate yanks. Inside the cabin, the temperature had dropped to 38 degrees. Clara felt the 3 sharp tugs on the rope. She wrapped the nylon cord around her forearms and began to haul. "Come on, Tom," she grunted, her boots slipping on the hardwood floor as she dragged the heavy weight of a man through thigh-deep snow. 2 minutes later, the front door burst open. Tom collapsed onto the floor, the heavy battery skidding across the rug. He was a snowman, completely encased in ice, his breathing ragged and shallow. Clara didn't stop to ask if he was okay. Time was out. She grabbed the truck battery, lugged it to the utility closet, and stripped the alligator clips from her dead marine battery. She clamped the red and black leads onto the fresh, massive truck battery terminals. Click! The green light on the inverter illuminated. A second later, the beautiful low hum of the inline fans returned. Within minutes, the warm, 65-degree air began to pour out of the floor registers, a subterranean resurrection. The earth was breathing again. Clara rushed back to Tom, helping him strip off the frozen gear. His fingers were white, but as the room slowly warmed, the color began to return with agonizing, burning pain. He leaned against the wall, exhausted, watching the digital thermometer on the wall slowly climb from 38 back to 40, 45, 50. "We did it," Tom whispered. For 5 days, the deep freeze held the town of Pine Ridge hostage. For 5 days, the grid remained dead, the skies remained dark, and the wind howled like a wounded animal. But inside the cabin, the heavy truck battery provided enough continuous power to keep the fans spinning. The massive thermal block of earth beneath them, charged by the forgotten heat of summer, never wavered. It dumped millions of BTUs of stored thermal energy into the small living space, keeping the 3 of them safe, warm, and alive. When the storm finally broke on Sunday morning, the sky dawned a brilliant, piercing blue. The temperature rose to a balmy 10 degrees above zero. Sheriff Miller and Deputy Harrison arrived at Clara's property on a tracked snowcat, fully expecting to find a tragedy. The town had suffered immensely. Pipes had burst in every home. Generators had failed, and dozens of people were hospitalized with severe frostbite. When the sheriff knocked on the door, Clara opened it wearing a light fleece pullover. Behind her, Tom was cooking pancakes on the butane stove, and Chloe was laughing at something he said. The cabin was a comfortable 55 degrees. Sheriff Miller stood in the doorway, staring at the warm air wafting out into the freezing morning. He looked at Clara, then at the snow-covered glass boxes on the side of her house. "Ma'am," the sheriff said, taking off his hat in utter bewilderment. "How in the world are you surviving in here?" Clara smiled, looking down at the floorboards, knowing exactly what lay beneath them. "I didn't survive the winter, Sheriff," she replied softly. "I just brought the summer with me." The story of Clara Higgins and her subterranean battery spread far beyond the mountains of Montana. She was no longer the eccentric neighbor. She was the architect of a new kind of resilience. In a world where the infrastructure built to protect us was becoming increasingly fragile, Clara had proven that true security didn't come from a louder generator or a bigger fuel tank. It came from understanding the earth, storing its gifts, and having the courage to trust it when the long, dark cold finally came. If Clara's incredible story of resilience and ingenuity inspired you, don't keep it to yourself. Hit that like button to support these real-life survival stories. Share this video with friends and family who need to see the power of self-reliance, and subscribe to our channel for more amazing tales of human triumph. What would you do in a grid failure? Let us know in the comments below.